My parents abandoned me to become diving instructors in Indonesia. Now dad's dying, and they want my kidney and money. Today, I, 21F, had the most surreal and infuriating encounter of my life. My parents, who literally left the country and abandoned me when I was 16, showed up out of nowhere after years of zero contact. They sat across from me at a coffee shop near my college and, with straight faces, asked me to donate a kidney to my father and help pay for his medical bills. The audacity left me speechless. For context, I need to start from the beginning. I was never wanted. My father, Michael, 46M, was adamantly against having children. He valued his freedom, travel plans, and child-free lifestyle above all else. My mother, Sarah, 44F, initially agreed with this plan, but eventually changed her mind after seeing her sister and friends having babies. This created a massive rift between them. After months of arguments and fights, my father finally gave in, not because he wanted a child, but because he was tired of fighting. That's how I came into this world, as a compromise, not as a wanted child, and they made sure I knew it my entire life. From the moment I was born, my mother realized motherhood wasn't what she expected. She hated everything about it: the diapers, the crying, the responsibility. My father provided zero help with childcare, making the situation worse. Within weeks of my birth, my mother started passing me off to my aunt, Lisa, 42F, and grandmother, Margaret, 68F, for increasingly longer periods. By the time I was 2, I spent more time with my aunt and grandmother than with my actual parents. They became my real family. My aunt treated me like her own daughter. She called me her little sunshine, braided my hair, read me stories, and showed me genuine love. My grandmother provided stability and basic care that my parents couldn't be bothered to give. My cousins welcomed me like a sister, including me in all their activities and games. Meanwhile, my parents took frequent trips, first for weekends, then for weeks, and eventually months at a time. They dropped me off at my grandmother's without much notice and with vague promises about when they'd return. As a young child, I missed them terribly. I wrote them letters filled with my childish love and longing, hoping they'd miss me too. They rarely responded. Even when they returned from trips, they'd make excuses about being too busy to see me right away. My grandmother eventually confronted my mother about her neglect, which resulted in brief, obligatory visits. My mother would bring expensive toys as substitutes for affection, toys that showed she knew nothing about my interests or personality. My father remained completely uninvolved, always finding reasons to avoid spending time with me. After years of this pattern, I stopped hoping for their love and accepted their indifference as normal. When I was 10, everything changed. My grandmother was diagnosed with cancer and could no longer care for me. My aunt confronted my parents, demanding they finally take responsibility for their child. My father flatly refused, and my mother tried to push me off on my aunt. The argument escalated until my aunt threatened to call Child Protective Services. Only then, faced with potential legal consequences, did my parents reluctantly agree to take me in. Living with my parents was miserable. They made no effort to hide the resentment toward me. The house was always silent and tense, completely different from the warmth and laughter at my grandmother's home. I tried to be perfect. I kept quiet, excelled in school, and helped with housework, hoping they might finally accept me. But nothing changed. My father refused to pay for any extracurricular activities. My mother barely acknowledged my existence, often forgetting to pick me up from school or notice when I was sick. They continued taking trips, leaving me alone with minimal food and no supervision. I learned to be completely self-sufficient, cooking simple meals, doing laundry, and taking care of myself. My grandmother called daily despite her illness, providing emotional support. My aunt brought meals and spent time with me whenever possible, trying to fill the void my parents created. As I entered my teens, the situation deteriorated further. My father developed a serious drinking problem and began gambling. Their fights escalated, with me always the scapegoat. My father would scream that I had ruined his life and relationship. My mother would repeatedly apologize to him for getting pregnant, as if my existence was the great mistake that destroyed everything good in their lives. I tried once to intervene during a particularly bad fight, only to be told to stay out of it and go to my room. I spent many nights hiding in my closet with my hands over my ears, terrified and feeling completely helpless. On my 16th birthday, they delivered their final blow. Instead of a celebration, they announced they were selling everything and moving to Indonesia. My father wanted to become a diving instructor, and my mother was going with him. They planned to leave me with my grandmother permanently, offering minimal financial support. When I pointed out that my grandmother was still recovering from cancer treatments, they were unmoved. My mother coldly stated they had sacrificed enough and deserved happiness. My father told me I was old enough to take care of myself and my grandmother. I was devastated but also relieved. I moved back in with my grandmother, who had thankfully recovered enough to provide a stable home. My aunt and cousins continued to be my real family, offering the love and support my parents never could. I graduated high school with honors and earned a full scholarship to college. My parents missed every milestone. They sent no cards, made no calls, showed no interest whatsoever in my life or achievements. For 5 years, I had no contact with them. I occasionally checked my mother's social media to see them living their apparently happy, child-free life in Indonesia. I built my own life, focused on my education, and found peace with my chosen family. Then, last week, my phone rang with an unknown number. It was my mother, sounding casual and upbeat, as if we'd spoken last week instead of 5 years ago. She said they were back in town and wanted to see me. When I questioned her motives, she seemed offended and claimed they had realized the importance of family and wanted to reconnect. I was skeptical but agreed to meet them at a coffee shop near campus. I asked my aunt and grandmother to come with me for support. When my parents arrived and saw them, they were visibly upset. My father looked unwell, thin, and jaundiced. After some awkward small talk, I directly asked what they wanted. They avoided the question at first, talking about missing me and wanting to be part of my life again. Finally, after pushing for the truth, my father admitted he had kidney failure and needed a transplant. They had returned home for better medical care after depleting their savings in Indonesia. My mother then asked if I would move in with them, get a job to help pay for his treatments, and get tested as a potential kidney donor. I was stunned by their audacity. My mother actually said my life could finally have a purpose and that children are supposed to help their parents in times of need. My grandmother and aunt were furious. I told them that after a lifetime of neglect and abandonment, they had no right to ask anything of me. My father pleaded, saying he would be a real father if I helped him and that I would feel guilty if he died. My grandmother threatened to get a restraining order if they continued harassing me. We left them sitting in that coffee shop. I blocked their numbers and social media accounts, but I'm still shaking with anger and disbelief. Part of me feels guilty. I don't want my father to die, but I refuse to be used by people who never once acted like parents. My aunt says I owe them nothing, but I'm haunted by my father's words about guilt. I'm staying with my grandmother for now, worried they might show up at my apartment. I don't know what to do next. Does standing my ground make me a terrible person? How do I process this unexpected reappearance of people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, but never did? Update: it's been 3 weeks since the coffee shop confrontation, and the situation has only escalated. I want to thank everyone for the overwhelming support on my original post. Your comments helped me feel validated in my decision to refuse my parents' requests. The day after I posted, my mother started a campaign to pressure me into helping my father. She contacted extended family members I barely know, telling them a completely twisted version of our story, claiming they had always wanted to be involved in my life but my aunt and grandmother had kept me away from them. She portrayed herself as a loving mother whose daughter was cruelly refusing to save her dying father's life. Several distant relatives called or messaged me, urging me to reconsider. My mother even found my roommate's number somehow and left a voicemail begging her to convince me to get tested as a kidney donor. When that didn't work, she showed up at my campus. I was in the library when I got a text from a classmate saying my mother was wandering around asking for me. Campus security had to escort her off the premises. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from a lawyer representing my parents. It wasn't an actual lawsuit, more of a thinly veiled threat suggesting I had a moral and familial obligation to assist my father. I took it to my aunt's friend, who works as an attorney, and she assured me there was no legal basis for their claims. She drafted a cease and desist letter on my behalf, warning them that further harassment would result in legal action. Around this time, I also discovered something that made everything even more complicated. While staying at my grandmother's house, I overheard a late-night conversation between her and my aunt that was never meant for my ears. They were discussing something from the past, specifically the arrangement when my parents first started leaving me with them. Apparently, my parents had been paying my grandmother a significant amount of money to care for me, more than was necessary for my basic needs. My grandmother had been saving this excess money in an account for me, which now contained enough to pay for my final year of college and graduate school. She had planned to tell me about it when I graduated. This revelation hit me hard. It suggested my parents had at least financially acknowledged their responsibility, even if they emotionally abandoned me. It wasn't parenting, more like paying someone else to parent, but it was something I hadn't known about. I confronted my grandmother the next morning, asking why she had kept this from me. She explained that she feared I would misinterpret the money as evidence that my parents cared. She believed it would give me false hope for a relationship that would never materialize. My aunt added that the payments stopped completely when I turned 16, and they left the country, breaking their promise to continue supporting me through college. I spent days processing this information, wondering if it changed anything. Part of me felt I should acknowledge this one small way they had provided for me, but another part recognized that outsourcing parenthood while taking zero interest in my welfare wasn't something to be grateful for. While I was still grappling with this, my father's condition worsened. He was hospitalized with complications from his kidney failure. My mother called my aunt in hysterics, blaming me for his deterioration and demanding she convince me to get tested. My aunt refused and told her not to call again. Then came the most manipulative move yet. My parents created a GoFundMe page titled, "Help Save a Father Rejected by His Daughter." It included childhood photos of me they must have gotten from relatives, alongside recent pictures of my father in his hospital bed. The description painted me as a heartless daughter refusing to even get tested to see if I was a match, while conveniently omitting their years of neglect and abandonment. The campaign was shared in our community and quickly raised several $1,000s. Friends from high school messaged me, asking if the story was true. One of my professors even mentioned seeing it. I felt humiliated and violated. My private family trauma turned into a public spectacle without my consent. I was overwhelmed with anger and anxiety. My grades started slipping, and I had trouble sleeping. My roommate suggested I might benefit from speaking with the free counseling services at our university, which I reluctantly agreed to try. The counselor helped me develop coping strategies for dealing with the immediate stress, though I've only attended 2 sessions so far. Yesterday, my aunt took matters into her own hands. She created a detailed social media post countering my parents' narrative, describing their years of neglect and how they had left the country, abandoning a 16-year-old. She included photos of them traveling during times they claimed they were trying to be in my life and screenshots of birthday wishes from family members that my parents never acknowledged or participated in. Her post was shared widely among our family and local community, causing many people to withdraw their support from the GoFundMe. My mother called me screaming, saying we were killing my father by turning people against them when they desperately needed financial help. For the first time, I spoke directly to her instead of hanging up. I told her that while I didn't wish death on my father, I wasn't responsible for saving him. I reminded her that they had chosen to leave me behind and build a life without me, and they couldn't suddenly decide I was valuable only when they needed something from me. She broke down crying, not with remorse, but with frustration that her plan wasn't working. She admitted they had discussed reconnecting with me months ago when they first learned about his condition, but had waited until it was severe enough that I would feel maximum pressure to help. I hung up and broke down. Despite everything, hearing her confirm they had calculated the best timing to manipulate me was devastating. My grandmother held me while I cried, reminding me that I had always been loved, just not by the people who should have loved me most. I'm exhausted by all of this. The counselor suggested I take a medical leave from school this semester, but I refuse to let them disrupt my education any further. Instead, I've moved temporarily to my aunt's house, which is in a gated community where my parents can't show up unannounced. I've also deactivated all my social media accounts to escape the public nature this conflict has taken. I still don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Every time I start to feel confident in my decision, the guilt creeps back in, not because I believe I owe them anything, but because, despite everything, there's still a small part of me, the child who wrote those unanswered letters, that desperately wanted their love. Update 2. It's been 2 months since my last update, and so much has happened that I hardly know where to begin. First, I want to thank everyone for the continued support and advice. It has meant everything during this difficult time. The most significant development is that my father received a kidney transplant 3 weeks ago, not from me, but from my mother. After all the drama and manipulation to try to get me to donate, it turned out she was a match all along. They apparently knew this from preliminary testing, but still chose to pressure me instead. I learned this from my uncle, my mother's brother, whom I haven't seen in years. He reached out after seeing my aunt's social media post about the situation. He told me my mother had always been identified as a potential donor, but had been reluctant to undergo the surgery herself. They had focused on me instead, hoping I would volunteer so she wouldn't have to do it. When public opinion turned against them after my aunt's post and their GoFundMe contributions began to be withdrawn, my mother finally agreed to be the donor. My uncle was disgusted by their behavior and felt I deserved to know the truth. He apologized for not being more present in my life and admitted he had believed my parents' version of events for years. This revelation was both vindicating and infuriating. They had created this entire drama, causing me immense stress and public humiliation when a solution was available all along. It confirmed what I had suspected, that their sudden interest in reconnecting was purely self-serving. After the transplant, my mother attempted to use her sacrifice to guilt me into reconciliation. She sent a long email from her hospital bed, describing the pain she was in and how she had given a piece of herself to save my father. She wrote that after such a significant sacrifice, surely I could find it in my heart to forgive them and be a family again. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Her sacrifice didn't erase 16 years of neglect and abandonment, nor did it change the fact that they had tried to manipulate me before resorting to this option. Meanwhile, I focused on finishing the semester strong, despite the ongoing stress. My professors were understanding after I explained the situation, and with some extra study sessions, I managed to maintain my GPA. I've continued meeting with the university counselor bi-weekly, which has been helpful for processing everything. The most unexpected development came from my grandmother. After seeing how my parents had manipulated the truth about financial support, she decided it was time to share the whole story. She sat me down and showed me years of correspondence between her and my parents, emails, text messages, and even handwritten notes. What I learned changed my understanding of my childhood. My parents hadn't just been absent physically, they had actively avoided responsibility at every turn. There were messages from my mother asking my grandmother not to bother them with updates about me unless it was an emergency. There were emails declining invitations to school events with flimsy excuses. There was even a message from my father explicitly stating they regretted having me and wished they could just pay the problem away. Most heartbreaking were the copies of letters and cards I had made for them as a child, returned to my grandmother unopened with notes asking her to dispose of them as they were cluttering their mailbox. My grandmother had kept them all, unable to destroy something I had put so much hope into creating. She apologized for keeping these painful truths from me, but explained she had always hoped my parents would change and didn't want to permanently damage any chance of a relationship. She realized now that protecting their image had only made me question my own worth and memories. Reading through this archive was excruciating but clarifying. Any lingering guilt I felt about refusing to help them evaporated. They hadn't just been uncomfortable with parenthood or overwhelmed by responsibility. They had actively rejected any connection to me while presenting a different face to the rest of the family. Last week, I received notice that my father has been discharged from the hospital and is recovering well. My mother included a note saying they still hope to see me, and that nearly dying changes a person. She wrote that my father had been asking for me and wanted a chance to apologize in person. I discussed this with my aunt and grandmother, who advised caution but ultimately said the decision was mine. After much consideration, I decided I wasn't ready to see them. Maybe someday I will be, but right now, the wounds are still too fresh, and I don't trust their motives. Instead, I wrote a brief email stating I was glad he was recovering, but that I needed space and time. I asked them to respect my boundaries and not contact me again until I reached out to them. I don't know if they'll honor this request, but setting the boundary felt important. For now, I'm focusing on my upcoming final year of college and applying to graduate programs. My aunt helped me secure an internship for the summer that will strengthen my applications, and I'm looking forward to having something positive to focus on. I still have moments of sadness about the parents I never had, but I'm increasingly grateful for the family that chose to love me. My grandmother, aunt, and cousins have shown me what real family means, not through grand gestures or sacrifices, but through consistent presence, support, and unconditional love. Update 3. It's been 6 months since my last update, and I wanted to share what will likely be my final post on this situation. First, thank you to everyone who has followed my story and offered support throughout this difficult journey. 3 months ago, my father died from complications related to his kidney transplant. His body rejected the organ despite immunosuppressant medications, and he developed an infection that his weakened immune system couldn't fight. I received the news from my uncle, not my mother. I didn't attend the funeral. It was a decision I struggled with, but ultimately felt was right for me. I sent flowers with a simple card expressing my condolences, but chose to remember him in my own way. On the day of his funeral, I visited a park where my aunt used to take me as a child and sat by the lake, reflecting on the complicated emotions surrounding his death. I felt sadness, but not in the way most people mourn a parent. I mourned the relationship we never had and the father he chose not to be. I felt anger that still hasn't fully subsided, and I felt a strange sense of closure, the definitive end to any possibility, however remote, of reconciliation. 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother showed up unannounced at my apartment. She looked terrible, thin, unkempt, clearly not taking care of herself. She wasn't hostile or manipulative this time. Instead, she seemed broken and lost. She said she didn't blame me for not coming to the funeral and that she understood why I had kept my distance. She told me my father had expressed regret in his final days, not just about how they had approached me for the kidney, but about the way they had failed as parents throughout my life. She showed me a letter he had dictated to a nurse when he knew he wasn't going to recover. It was addressed to me, acknowledging his failings and expressing hope that I would have a good life. I don't know if his deathbed remorse was genuine or if my mother fabricated or embellished it to ease her own conscience. Either way, it came too late to repair what had been broken long ago. My mother asked if we could try to build some kind of relationship moving forward. She said she was planning to stay in the area rather than return to Indonesia and wanted a chance to make things right. When I didn't immediately respond, she didn't push or try to guilt me. She simply gave me her new contact information and said the ball was in my court. I told her I needed time to think about it. The truth is, I don't know if I want any relationship with her. The damage runs deep, and I'm not convinced her current remorse would translate into genuine care and respect for my boundaries. But I also recognize that people can change, especially after experiencing profound loss. For now, I've decided to maintain distance while leaving the door slightly open. I sent her an email establishing clear boundaries, no unannounced visits, respectful communication only, and an understanding that we would never have a typical mother-daughter relationship. I explained that any connection would need to develop gradually and on my terms. She responded, accepting these conditions and thanking me for being willing to consider any contact at all. We've exchanged a few brief civil emails since then, mostly her sharing information about her life and asking general questions about mine, which I answer selectively. Meanwhile, my own life has moved forward in positive ways. I graduated college with honors and have been accepted to a prestigious graduate program with a full scholarship. My grandmother's health has been stable, and we've been able to travel together to visit family I hadn't seen in years. My relationship with my aunt and her family remains the strongest and most nurturing connection in my life. She has been my true parent in every way that matters, and I recently asked if I could call her mom. She cried and said she had always felt like my mother in her heart. The trust fund my grandmother maintained from my parents' payments has covered my graduate school application fees and will help with living expenses when I move from my program. I've decided to use that money without guilt, not as a connection to my parents, but as a resource that is rightfully mine. As for my mother, I don't know what the future holds. I'm proceeding with extreme caution and realistic expectations. Maybe we'll develop some form of limited relationship, or maybe I'll eventually decide that complete separation is healthier. Either way, I'll make that decision based on what's best for my well-being, not out of obligation or guilt. I've learned that family is defined by consistent love and support, not by biology. The people who choose to stay, who show up repeatedly, who celebrate your victories and hold you during defeats, they are your real family, regardless of DNA. I'm fortunate to have found that kind of family, even if it wasn't with the people who gave me life.